Good afternoon again. Thanks very much. Hope you enjoyed that last panel. I certainly did. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our next introducer. It's Mara Motherway. She is the Senior Vice President of Government and Customer Relations at one of our sponsors, Peraton, and she will introduce our next panel on technology and national security. Thank you. Thanks, Mara.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's my distinct honor to introduce this panel on technology and national security, most of all because of the distinguished group taking the stage. None of them need much of an introduction. Jane Harman is one of the primary reasons we have the Aspen Security Forum. Without her leadership and commitment to this event, it would not be what it is. It gathers the very best in our business of international affairs and national security. And of course, Michelle Flournoy is the very best, from leading DoD policy to now at West Exec, and I dare say we will be looking for her to continue to serve. And Kent Walker, who has spent a career working at the intersection of national security and technology, from Netscape to eBay, to, for the last 16 years, a little-known company called Google. Moderating will be the journalist who knows this topic better than any, David Sanger. His book from 4 years ago, The Perfect Weapon, War, Sabotage, and Fear in the Cyber Age, is one of the best. I look forward to hearing and learning, David. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much. Great to see all of you here, and I want to thank all of the audience here because you have been resisting the temptations of another gorgeous Aspen day. It's great to be here with three great panel members, and we're also all dear friends, so I'm really looking forward to this, this whole discussion. I wanted to start with the lessons that we can draw from the Russia-Ukraine conflict, because there are some who believe, and I think it's not yet a completely proven fact, that this is a turning point in the way corporate America has delved into a fight for democracy. There are a lot of lessons from the cyber war of this, there are a lot of lessons in the information war, but it's also curious that the kind of corporate moves to support Ukraine that we've seen, we didn't see in 2014. We didn't see when Russia went into Georgia. So the first question I've got is, what's different? What was different about this conflict? And I think, Ken, I'm going to start with you on that.
Sure. Clearly, the situation in Ukraine was an extraordinary one, and we have seen it play out not just in a military war, an economic war, but also in a cyber war, a war of disinformation. So when the technology community is responding to that, we are looking to do things at Google like push to demonetize services in Russia, make sure that YouTube remains up as an independent source of information, but also remove disinformation from Sputnik and RT around the world, working with the Ukrainian government to make sure that they are safe against attack. We rolled out our Project Shield to more than 200 different websites in Ukraine. It's relatively easy to DDoS a small website. It's harder to DDoS Google, where we can provide information to people that they're being attacked by foreign state actors. We've done that as part of our commitment to protect more people online than any other company around the world. So sending out thousands of foreign state actor alerts when people's Gmail was being compromised. All of that is important, but maybe most fundamentally is the work we've done with the Ukrainian government to help them secure their own infrastructure. Because the best way not to be attacked is not to have vulnerable infrastructure in the first place. Now, David, you asked about the question of why is this time different, and I think it's an important one. Clearly, the international community has responded in a dramatic way to this invasion. When you see the United Nations voting 141-5, when you see that Munich Security Conference, you and I spoke, seeing unprecedented transatlantic unity around this set of issues, the European Union coming together as one to push back against Russian aggression, that empowers the technology companies of the world to also stand up and to make strong steps. So, we were proud to have been the first company to be awarded the Ukrainian government's Special Peace Prize in recognition of the various things we've done, and others have done work as well. So it's a unique moment in history, and we'll see how it plays out from here.
Ken, one follow-up on that. We all were watching Google with some care because after Project Maven, we had a sense of a workforce that was nervous about working closely with the Pentagon. What was a reaction within, I'm sure it's not unified, but the overall reaction within the Google workforce for coming in pretty heavily on one side of a conflict here?
Well, I think this is a gradual long-term evolution where we have seen greater understanding of the need to contribute to national security, cyber defense. We have been public about our work with the U.S. government and other democratic governments around the world. The JWCC, other government contracts. We recently launched Google Public Service, devoted to working with the U.S. government. We're trying to do that in a public way and bringing our employees along. But it also shows more generally the importance of building bridges between the Pentagon, between the U.S. government, between the national security community, and academia and Silicon Valley. Because I think too often in the past, people in uniform had never met a computer science PhD, and many computer science PhDs have never met somebody in the military. And understanding where there is commonality, where we can work with shared purpose is extraordinarily important.
So Michelle, take us back a bit, because when you were Undersecretary for Policy, could you have imagined this kind of response that involved Silicon Valley, corporate America, to the degree that it did? Could you imagine the US government, that time the Obama administration, but I wouldn't limit it just to Democrats or just to the Obama administration, being ready to try to marshal those resources 6 or 7 years ago the way the Biden administration did here?
You know, it's hard to say, but I think after Crimea in particular, I think, and watching him over time, watching this very slow, methodical buildup of forces on the Ukraine border, I think the assessment of Vladimir Putin and what he's capable of, and particularly as he turns to this sort of more imperialistic approach to establishing his legacy, kind of reestablishing a sphere of influence that looks kind of like the former Soviet Union, starting with Georgia and others, but now focused on Ukraine. I think the threat has finally registered. I also think we're at a different point in the international system where 10 years ago, we were focused on globalization, we were focused on integrating countries like China and others into the global economy to try to use Bob Zelek's phrase, if he's here, you know, make them responsible stakeholders. I think with the changes that we've seen in China's behavior, Russia's behavior, the sort of increasing alliance between authoritarian states, I think there's just a different threat perception now with regard to Putin. That said, I want to say I was pleasantly surprised by how quickly and how massively the private sector moved on Russia. That said, I know we'll talk about this down the road, but this is an easier case than the China case would be. I mean, there's not so much dependency on Russia other than for energy and particularly in Europe, but you know, our supply chains aren't so dependent. There's not the same level of dependency, vulnerability, integration that we would see, you know, if for example, a China moved against a Taiwan. So there are some lessons to be learned here, particularly in how we declassified intelligence and set the fact base to build a coalition and to affect public opinion. Also in how we help the Ukrainians to, you know, move their information to the cloud before their servers were bombed, and to enhance their cybersecurity. So there are some lessons that translate, but there are others that will be much more difficult in a future crisis situation with, say, Beijing coming against Taiwan.
I'm going to ask this one of you and then also of Jane. So corporate executives I've spoken to, even some who were out here, have made the good point to me that, you know, Russia, while we were trying to integrate it into the world economy, was maybe 2% of revenues, right? So complying with the incentive to pull out was not great. And many companies weren't in Russia to
Wasn't
begin
that painful?
with. Yeah, it was not painful at all. China would be a very different situation. So I want to ask you what you think corporations would do about that. And I want to ask Jane what she thinks Congress would do about trying to mandate that.
You know, you can be sure that right now in China, they are studying this question of how would they be hurt by sanctions and what leverage could they use to retaliate. Every U.S. corporation that has a major supply chain dependency in China needs to be doing contingency planning to first understand where those dependencies and vulnerabilities are, and then to imagine a situation where they were, they had to shift their dependency, either because there were sanctions that prohibited activity, or because China would retaliate by cutting off certain supplies. That's not something you do in a crisis. If you haven't done that years in advance to create more resiliency, less dependency and vulnerability in your supply chain, you will suffer very badly in the crisis. So, I mean, that is an area where I run a strategic advisory firm in my day job. I think just about every CEO that has a strong engagement with China or strong interdependency is looking at this question right now and looking at the resilience question.
And Jane, when this hit Congress, I mean, think about it, there are not many products or jobs in the United States that are reliant on trade with Russia. Complete opposite with China. What would the political reality of this be?
Well, first, David, let me congratulate you again on your wonderful book. Not that the rest of us haven't written books, but I want to point out to everybody that David's book was written at the Wilson Center, where I was president and CEO. And so my view is that David was a middle-level reporter for the New York Times until he came to the Wilson Center. Just want you all to know, a little PR for the Wilson Center. So I'm sitting at the far end here because I'm the untechie. My theory of this is that politicians and recovering politicians are analog, and they have to deal with digital problems, which is a reach for most of us. So I'm just saying, I put that out there. So when I sound dumb, that's why I'm dumb. On this issue, first of all, well, let me also say kudos to Google and to Microsoft for heroic work in Ukraine. Let no one diminish what you have done. And your workforce deserves it too, not just your leadership. I'm sure a lot of people in the workforce, everyone has been mobilized by #MeToo and racial justice and other issues, and I think workforces are paying close attention, and this is a humanitarian and legal catastrophe, and they wanted to help, so.
There are Ukrainian flags flying in the streets of San Francisco,
well, you
which
bet.
is not something I would have seen years ago.
And oh, by the way, at the welcoming dinner for this, which I hosted for the 8th time, our theme was Ukraine and Ukrainian art and culture, because that's one of the things Russia wants to eradicate, because Ukraine is not a country and they're all Nazis, et cetera. I don't want to go there. So let's talk about China. China is a really interesting bipolar case for Congress. That's how I would put it. Bashing China is easy. You get a lot of votes to say China's bad, ooh. I was called an agent of communist China at one point, don't ask, it was ridiculous, by one of my Democratic opponents. But that's good rhetoric. The amount of information in Congress about China is an inch deep. But the amount of rhetoric is a mile deep. So you get to this case, and this is hard because corporations and the supply chain, Michelle just said that, and I totally know that we all agree on this, will be seriously hurt if the contingency planning isn't seamless. And it probably won't be seamless. Big firms can probably do it. Smaller firms can't. And the other piece of this is that all of our neighbors in Asia, and we now have, and I applaud President Biden for this, an Asia strategy. He has the Quad, he has this new trade organization. Sadly, we got out of TPP, and China got into it. But all of these countries have bigger trade relationships, at least now, so far as I know, with China than with us. So what happens to them if they get penalized too? And so I think it's the right question to ask. I would not count on Congress to come up with any kind of nuanced answer. Rhetoric, yes. Nuanced answer, not so much.
Can I just add one thing? In the last administration, this idea of decoupling, complete decoupling from China, was raised as if it was both desirable and possible. It's neither. What we're talking about, there's some supply chains which interdependence is fine. There are other supply chains that affect national security, that affect public health, like dealing with the next pandemic, that affect high technology, that really do matter, where we have to be. So this is a case where you've got to really do some analysis and use not a sledgehammer to break the relationship in all of its ties, but a scalpel to sort of disentangle the supply chains that really matter strategically.
And you don't usually see that happening. You know, I try to ask people to think on a sliding scale. Would it be okay to bring in military uniforms from Russia? Yeah, you can inspect them, you can see them. Would you want to be buying your stealth fighters from China? Probably not. Yeah. And almost everything falls in the dead middle of that, as you would point out. That takes me, Michelle, to the question of what the U.S. needs to invest in for the drivers of our own technology. And as we speak here, the long-suffering CHIPS Act and its related Innovation Act is struggling to make its way through Congress before they go out on recess. To remind everyone, this is the bill that passed the Senate with a pretty resounding bipartisan majority in June of 2021 through the House. No, through the Senate. And two different versions, right. And the House then took up a different version. They've been in, and that was more recently, they've been in conference. It spent more than a year to try to demonstrate that we could churn something out here, and it became a Christmas tree and had all of its usual other issues. What have we learned from this process? Because Jane tells us China's a unifying issue in Congress, but it wasn't unifying enough in this case to get this moving quickly.
I mean, I think what we've learned is that our own polarized politics are our greatest enemy. Like, if you ask me objectively, whose hand would I like to play? China's hand, our hand, Russia's hand, in terms of just natural strengths, you know, like our innovation ecosystem, our talent, et cetera. I would take the U.S. hand every day, but we're not playing it very well because we're stumbling over our own politics and in some cases bureaucracy. So if you think of, you know, what are the things we need to do to invest in the fundamental drivers of our own competitiveness, because that's how, you know, that's how we do well, and we're able to set the rules of the road. One, science and technology investment, research and development. And the fact is, you know, we're no longer living in an age where government puts the preponderance of research and development money on the table. Companies like Google and Microsoft and many others are driving the R&D and the innovation in our economy. But government can place bets that send signals and incentivizes and attracts private capital to come and focus on an area of strategic import for the nation. Smart immigration policy. We have always been a magnet for talent. You know, look at the founders in Silicon Valley. Half of them are either recent immigrants or first-generation Americans. We want the best and brightest from around the world to come to the United States, and then we want to make sure that they stay and they make their lives and their businesses here. So that's a pretty different tune than what we're hearing right now on Capitol Hill on immigration. STEM, investment in STEM, education, access to higher education, bringing, you know, drawing on the full talent of our population, not just the privileged few. So, I mean, there's so much that we need to do that really, that it's essential to being competitive. And I'll just add one last one, having a DoD background. I don't think the problem is anymore that Silicon Valley doesn't want to work with the Pentagon. There are myriad technology companies that have something that they're mission focused, they want to contribute to national security, and our own regulations, bureaucratic hurdles, and the way we do business just makes it really, really hard for them to actually succeed. So we have a lot of internal reform to do to close that gap and sort of grab the hand that's reaching out and saying, I want to help.
I'll come back to ask you to drill down on that for a minute, but Kent, let me ask you, in the legislation that's going through Congress now, and we don't know what its final form will be, but I looked at where it was last night, and the $52 billion for semiconductors was there, and then some, but not all of the long-term stuff was there. These seem to play quite differently in the Valley. So you've had semiconductor manufacturers say, look, if we don't get the US government money, we could build someplace else. Intel at one moment thought that it might build some in China. That didn't go over so well in Congress. But they've also, as we were discussing before, been looking at Germany, which is also offering subsidies and elsewhere. So differentiate for us how the short-term issues like building new fabs are regarded in the Valley versus the sort of longer-term industrial policy of having the US government funding more research and development along the lines that Michelle described.
Both are important, and I subscribe completely to Michelle's comments. We obviously need the short-term incentives, but our core advantage as a society is our openness to the world. Some of these immigration points where Graham Allison has talked about the Million Talents program. How do we invest in the next generation of computer science PhDs who will push forward the frontiers of next generation cutting edge tools like AI or quantum and the like? This is going to be increasingly important as we go forward. So making sure we have a framework, a regulatory framework, an immigration framework, as well as a government funding framework is going to be critical. And at the same time, we want to get out of our own way. We need good tech regulation, but we also want to make sure that we don't overemphasize some aspects of that and forget the national security perspective, as we have some strong national champions who are able to be great platforms and advocates for American values around the world.
So Jane, tell us a little bit about how this looks in Congress, because as Michelle has pointed out, we're our own worst enemy when it comes to long supply chain, long issues on funding new technologies, getting Pentagon contracts going, turning an idea into a weapon system or a defensive system. There has been discussion in Congress for probably as long as I have covered this stuff, and it's a while, about reforming that process, and a few experiments, which Michelle helped go, but none of them have seemed to fundamentally change the way we acquire new technologies.
True, and that has really stymied us. Michelle is right. When Michelle becomes Secretary of Defense, we will fix all this. I just want you to know. It would be wonderful. The stumbling blocks are Congress in many ways because it's in the widget protection business. I remember, I'm guilty of this too. There were some ideas about realigning our space investments into Colorado, a state I happen to love and live in part-time. But hey, the South Bay of Los Angeles would have been hurt by that if we'd lost the Aerospace Corporation and the LA Air Force Base. So I fought to the death, and I won, with Leon Panetta's help, to keep these things there because the workforce and the education system, really good universities, depended on them staying there. So Congress is in the widget protection business. So is the Pentagon. It's very hard to change the way the Pentagon does business. We had this amazing man yesterday, I guess the tech investor in the Navy, talking about all the changes he'd like to make. Well, good luck with that. I hope it happens. But the thing that wasn't mentioned there, and I mentioned it later to Reed, is workforce. If you're going to move from hardware and platforms to a software-based new technology system, which sounds great and which would be good for some of our tech companies also, win-win. You gotta tell members of Congress that the jobs aren't gonna be lost, that these people are gonna be refitted for the new jobs, and that new jobs will involve human beings, not just robots and computer code. So, I think that these are a huge impediment. The last thing I would say is, at least as far as Congress goes, keep it simple. When all these bills are loaded up like Christmas trees, that's a marvelous term, and they're all passed in the dead of night, the day before Christmas, well, why not? They're Christmas trees. It is kind of scary because what gets stuck in there is not necessarily known to everybody and not necessarily the things everybody wants to do. Maybe some core section wants to. But I would just conclude on a positive note, which is the tech sector is really being helpful, really being a responsible citizen. I think 85% of our technology is in the private sector anyway. And so you're able to do creative destruction and renew yourselves and move to better, move to focus on things that are much more future-oriented. So maybe what we need is the tech sector in a responsible way, retooling Congress and the Pentagon.
Well, let me, if I could jump in, just to return the compliment a little bit, because I think both Michelle and you are right that we need procurement reform, particularly for the smaller companies, the startup companies who do want to contribute but can't find their way through the maze. But DoD and others are starting to do more in this area. The Defense Innovation Unit, I think, is an interesting pilot experiment. The Joint Artificial Intelligence Center, the JAIC, is it useful? The question is, how do you scale up? How do you go from pilot to scale and make that part of the warp and woof of the way military acquisitions and procurement happen?
So, Michelle, some of those started in your time, including the experiment that the prototype group that Kent described. What lessons have we learned from these, the JAIC and so forth?
Well, to be fair, they started under Bob Work and Chuck Hagel and then Ash Carter, so I shouldn't take credit. I think to be fair, the Pentagon has gotten a lot better in a couple of areas. Tech scouting. They're pretty good at now not just doing the tech tourism where the general shows up in Silicon Valley and gets the briefing and then nothing happens, but actually scouting and finding companies that they want to work with and finding mechanisms, competitions, demonstrations, what's called other transaction authorities, ways of bringing them in. They've also gotten really good at prototyping, like let's build something and see if it works and let the troops play with it. And that's all good. And Congress, to its credit, has actually given them lots of authorities to do that. Where we're stuck is taking those successful prototypes that the warfighter is really excited about having and actually transitioning them into production at scale. And there are a couple of problems. One of the timelines. The Pentagon plans many years ahead. So a company says, great, congratulations, you just won the competition. We will have you in the program maybe in 2 years. So a small company is like, 2 years? No, like what? I can't survive 2 years unless I get something from this. So there's got to be bridge funding, which Congress hates, and more flexibility to help companies across that valley of death. But the other thing that was really important that Jane said is the talent and human capital factor. One of the things I learned over and over again in the Pentagon is that you can't change behavior unless you change the incentive structure. Right now, we have incentivized and trained our acquisition corps to focus on keeping on cost, on schedule, being highly, highly risk averse because you're going to get dragged up before Congress and prosecuted publicly on national television for why your program is over cost or over budget. That doesn't work with software-driven systems, with agile development, where you have to have a higher risk tolerance. You iterate, you learn. Sometimes you succeed, sometimes you fail. You learn. That accelerates your path to success. You have to take a totally separate cadre of people, train them on agile development, train them on software acquisition as opposed to hardware, and then reward them. Showcase them, promote them, reward them, incentivize them when they deliver at scale and faster on these technologies. I don't think Eric is in the audience, but Eric Schmidt is here somewhere, and he has said repeatedly, we don't have an innovation problem. We have an innovation adoption problem. And so it's getting the system, both Congress and DoD, to make the incentive changes to actually allow us to adopt the technology. And I'll just say one last thing. I'm sorry to go on so long. This really matters. When we talk about strategic competition, we are at risk of the United States military losing its military edge. What does that mean? It means we don't deter successfully in the future. It means we may not even win in the future. This is really big stakes for our country. And unless we crack this nut and figure out how to leverage our innovation ecosystem and integrate it into the national security community with greater speed and scale, we will pay a very heavy price. So, I mean, the stakes are enormous. And again, I think there are good people in the Pentagon who are really trying hard and making progress, but we just need some additional help from Congress to go farther, faster.
So how about just a piece of good news that everybody forgot about that happened last week? It's not Pentagon-centric, but it is science and tech-centric, and that is the success of the Webb telescope. Did anybody see those pictures? That was 20,000 people in 20 years in the making. And we can now see into not just inner, but way, way outer space, 13 billion light years. I don't know what that exactly means. Somebody will tell me. But it's extraordinary. That's U.S. innovation, driven with allies and partners. I get that. And the celebration, which I actually went to at NASA, involved all kinds of other folks in other related places in the world. But how special that we can do that. If we can do that for science, we have to do that for our security. We have to do it. And we can also do it, just one last point that it seems so obvious to me. The Pentagon has the largest vehicle fleet in the country by a huge amount. If all of those vehicles and all of the things driven by oil and gas and fossil fuel engines were converted, not tomorrow morning, that would be a little painful, but over some really short time frame, we would drive clean energy and efficient uses of energy for the whole country and make huge markets for the private sector.
All good points. Before we go to the audience for questions, Kent, I have one last one for you. One thing we don't hear a whole lot from corporate America about, but we've seen some interesting examples of, is the cooperation with the intelligence community. And we saw it a lot in the run-up to the war. Michelle was mentioning the declassification of indicators that Putin was really going to invade. Some of those indicators came from tech companies, Google included, that were watching the cyber attacks that preceded kinetic attacks. Microsoft, I think, is distributing out here an interesting account of what they provided. I know you folks did as well. Back before the war rolled along, it was private companies that found SolarWinds, the remarkably innovative attack on software supply chain that the Russians did well ahead of any threat or major threat on Ukraine. So, people have talked for years about information sharing. What's really interesting to me here is there's a long run of intelligence that you and others are seeing that American intelligence agencies are blind to because they're not allowed to operate in the United States for a lot of good reasons. Tell us a little bit about sort of the two-way exchange here and where it stands now versus a while ago.
Yeah, I think the process is getting a lot better. On the government side, the vulnerabilities equities process, disclosing bugs to the private sector so we can patch and get ahead of attacks, has moved in a positive direction in recent years. At the same time, the government is a convening force for groups like the FBI's Foreign Influence Task Force or DHS Cybersecurity Review Board. Or the NSA's Cybersecurity Collaborative. These are important initiatives to establish trusted relationships so that you can provide information about threat intelligence in an aggregate way that's still very valuable. We really need to establish these sorts of ties within, both between companies and between companies and governments. And that process is evolving in positive ways. The more affirmative the threat becomes, the more real and concrete the threat becomes, the more you're seeing people incented to create these relationships and find ways of sharing information, find ways of publicizing information. Our threat assessment group, for example, has done a lot of work to actually attribute attacks. That's some of the hardest work in cybersecurity, as many of you know. But we feel there's a public obligation to be more transparent about the sources and methods that we're seeing out there in the wild to detect zero-day attacks. This is an echo of the work we did starting a dozen years ago with Project Aurora coming out of China. I was a federal prosecutor earlier in my career. One of the hardest things to do was to get private companies to come forward publicly or with government because they didn't want to be embarrassed by these attacks.
And Kent, what do you do when a country that is, the middling countries we're all struggling to try to win over a little more loyalty to, find themselves embarrassed by the results of your investigation. You must frequently find countries where attacks emanated, where you're also doing a fair bit of business. And I'm sure their response to you is, you want to attribute to us, that's fine, and you can pack up starting on Monday.
Look, these issues are always challenging. Even our Project Zero team, which early on, after the Aurora attack, started disclosing zero-day vulnerabilities in our products, but also in other products out in the landscape. That has led to some difficult conversations internally and with other companies, because nobody likes to be called out on these things, but it really is a team sport. It's a collective action problem. We're all only as strong as the weakest link. So when you look at Hafnium, when you look at SolarWinds, in many cases, it's not enough to be secure yourself. You have to have an entire secure supply chain. And in software, we're really only getting started with open source software security, et cetera. There's a lot more to do we're leaning into. Jane, it looks like you want to jump in.
Well, I just wanted to add two issues. One is, I think that technology is the way we found Osama bin Laden after 9/11. We got a lot smarter. Our intelligence community and our ability to track and trace and all that has morphed from that to something much more sophisticated. But there is another side to it. And you have to know Congress will raise that side, and that is the privacy issue. I mean, there is now advanced spyware, like the NSO company in Israel and Pegasus, which has been used by some. It has nothing to do with Google, to track politicians, to embarrass people for bad ends. And a U.S. company was trying to acquire the NSO, and the government blocked it. And Congress has to do a better job, of figuring out how to protect privacy and security at the same time. It's not a zero-sum game. And again, the analog members of Congress are not very good at this.
And the companies do as well. All of this has to be done in a responsible, balanced way that protects privacy rights, but simultaneously secures security. We believe you can be open and secure. In fact, in today's cloud environment, we think you have to be open and secure. And working through how best to do that is a key element in the private sector and in our partnerships with the government.
Okay, so we've got about 5 minutes, so we're gonna do some quick answers and quick questions and quick answers. Start right here. Mike's on your way.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Rebecca Kaiser from the National Science Foundation. My question is about dual-use technology. And we think about dual use as having a military use, weapons development, that type of thing. Jane Harman's example, the example of using visual recognition technologies to identify minority groups, these are concerning uses of technology. Do we need to change how we think about what dual use is?
Michelle?
I think the challenge is getting more complicated but I think that we do have to look at any technologies that, if a technology has the potential, with export to help an adversary's military or to assist a regime in oppressing its own populations or executing human rights violations. I think U.S. policy has to take that into account and to try to clarify where the lines are. And I actually think the administration's in the process of sharpening and refining some of those definitions and terms. The challenge is, this is a contact sport, and so companies who step forward and comply with those regulations, for example, vis-a-vis China and anything that is related to the oppression of the Uyghurs or surveillance technology on the population, and they comply with that and they put that language in their contracts in China, they get slammed by the Chinese government to say, wait a minute, what are you doing? You're taking sides. And they're like walking in a minefield every day trying to figure out how they, they're US companies, they're good citizens, they want to be compliant with US law, and they will be. But they're also working in a Chinese system where everything is linked. And something that you do over here is going to create a problem for you over there. So I think it's just a very difficult situation right now for a lot of U.S. companies, particularly, well, previously those who were operating in Russia, but now particularly those who are still operating in China.
And I think we can't just leave it to the government. It's, as Michelle says, it's an increasingly complicated area where you're dealing with basic research on something like artificial intelligence. It's not just dual use, it's multiple use. There could be 1,000 uses of some of the innovations that are coming out. And so I think it's important for companies like ours with our AI principles, or we worked with the government's National Security Commission on AI to establish ground rules to think about this line between basic research, productization, application. What kinds of applications are appropriate? Where do you need to have guardrails?
And also, let's talk about cost. A lot of the imaging that we see of where Russian troops are in Ukraine and so forth is done by commercial firms, which also do commercial imaging. And it's not all, let's assume none of it's nefarious. By leveraging commercial technology, we cut government costs, and then we can put those funds, if they're even appropriated by Congress ever, to better use.
Interesting utility of this. You mentioned before the government's declassification of much of that evidence. We obviously couldn't publish that declassified evidence until we confirmed it ourselves. We couldn't go by the government's word on it. You may recall how well that worked out during the Iraq War. And so we had to use a lot of these commercial technologies to make that work. I thought I saw a hand over here someplace. Where was it? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Doug Beck with Apple and part-time with the U.S. Navy. I have a question actually first maybe for you, Michelle, and then Jay, maybe if you could follow up. The question is, we have made a huge amount of progress in terms of the collaboration between the tech sector and national security. But as you said, the problem now is one of both scale and pace. And you talked a little about the urgency there. So if you could maybe comment first on where you see the sense of that urgency, right? What the time frame is that we need to be thinking about to make the progress we need to make so that we avoid the scenario that you laid out. And then, Jane, if you might maybe help comment a little bit on what it's going to take to translate that sense of urgency to the kind of sclerotic pace of change that you've described.
Yeah, so the Department of Defense has laid out a very clear set of technology priorities and is starting to make some major investments in those key areas. And I won't list them, there are like 14 of them. You can Google them. But a lot of those are not going to come to fruition until the 2030s. What worries me is when I talk to China watchers and I look at President Xi, who's a very different leader than his predecessors. Yes, for now, he's got his hands full. He's mishandled COVID and has a lot of problems still stemming from that. His economy has slowed down, which always terrifies the Communist Party in terms of maintaining its control. And he's got the 20th Party Congress coming in the fall, where he's hoping to consolidate his power for another term. But he's also been very clear in numerous statements that he sees the reintegration of Taiwan as part of China, mainland China, as a legacy issue. It's going to happen on his watch. And he's said this many times in many fora. I think we have to take him seriously. So the thing that worries me is I think there's a point in time where having tried political coercion doesn't work, economic envelopment doesn't fully work, he might look and say, if I wait to the 2030s when the U.S. has really set this theater with a lot more capability and new technologies and concepts, I'm not so sure I can get away with this. So the time I'm going to move is, even though it's not my first choice, but I'm going to move now. And that now is like 3 to 5 years. So when I say we're not moving fast enough, I think the department's doing incredible work for the mid to longer term. I am very worried that we are not pulling out all of the stops to maximize deterrence in the near to midterm, using what we have, combining it in new ways, and seriously bolstering our ability to either deny China's success or impose such costs that she will wait for another day.
Jane, we're in negative time, so really quick.
We're in negative time. Okay.
Yes.
Well, a positive comment is about the passage or the likely passage of some portion of the CHIPS Act. I mean, let's remember, if Taiwan is vulnerable, let's hope not, the largest chip manufacturer is based there, and we and China depend on that manufacturer. So developing some homegrown capacity is a really good idea. The other comment I'd make in one sentence is there has been a major trust problem between government and industry, and that's being repaired both at the Defense Department and the Department of Homeland Security. And part of the initiative to repair it comes from companies like Google. So I'd like to conclude, since we're out of time, by saying, yay, Google. That's all.
Jane is right. There is significant effort to get Taiwan Semiconductor and Samsung, both of which have agreed to build facilities in the United States. And when those are done, it will move almost 5% of their production over here, which tells you how much land we have to go. So I usually am accused of being the one to provide the downer notes, but I'm glad to say Michelle has stolen the title from me this time. That's it. But I want to thank you all. I want to thank all the members of the panel for this. Thank you.